Tycoon left pregnant spouse. 3 years passed, stumbled upon child at benefit event behind him. The soft padding of bare feet on marble floors announced the arrival of his wife, Olivia. She wrapped her arms around his waist, her swollen belly pressing against his back. Alexander tensed imperceptibly, a flicker of unease crossing his face before he schooled his features into a mask of calm. "Good morning, my love," Olivia murmured, her voice still husky with sleep. "Another early start?" Alexander turned, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "The Tokyo markets wait for no one, darling." He placed a hand on her belly, feeling a kick beneath his palm. A surge of emotion, part wonder, part terror, washed over him. Olivia beamed, placing her hand over his. "She's been active all night. I think she's eager to meet her daddy." The word daddy sent a jolt of panic through Alexander's chest. He swallowed hard, trying to push down the rising tide of anxiety. "I'm sure she is," he managed, his voice sounding strained even to his own ears. Olivia's brow furrowed, sensing the shift in his mood. "Alex, is everything all right? You've seemed distant lately." Alexander stepped away, busying himself with pouring a cup of coffee from the sleek machine on the counter. "Just busy, Liv. This merger is taking up all my time and energy." "I know, but..." Olivia hesitated, biting her lip. "I was hoping we could talk about the nursery today, and maybe start discussing names? We're running out of time." The cup in Alexander's hand trembled slightly. He set it down, gripping the edge of the counter to steady himself. The weight of expectation, of impending fatherhood, felt like a noose tightening around his neck. "Can we do this later?" he snapped, harsher than he intended. "I have a conference call in 10 minutes. Hurt flashed across Olivia's face, quickly replaced by a weary resignation. "Of course," she said softly. "Later." As she turned to leave, Alexander felt a pang of guilt. He wanted to reach out, to comfort her, to be the husband and soon-to-be father she deserved. But the words stuck in his throat, trapped behind a wall of fear and doubt. He watched her retreating form, the gentle swell of her belly a reminder of the life growing inside her, a life he had helped create but felt utterly unprepared for. In that moment, standing alone in the opulent kitchen of their penthouse, Alexander Reeves, titan of industry and master of the financial world, had never felt more lost or alone. The city stretched out before him, a testament to his success and power. Yet for all his achievements, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of a precipice, about to plummet into a world he didn't understand and wasn't sure he wanted. As the first rays of sunlight touched his face, Alexander closed his eyes, wishing he could freeze this moment, before fatherhood, before responsibility, before the inevitable change that was rushing towards him like a freight train. But time, like the markets he so deftly manipulated, waited for no one. And in the quiet of the morning, the clock ticked steadily forward, counting down to a future he both longed for and feared. "Mr. Reeves," his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Your 3 o'clock is here." Alexander cleared his throat, straightening his tie. "Send them in." The door opened, revealing not his expected client, but Olivia. She stood there, radiant in a flowing maternity dress, a tentative smile on her face. "Surprise," she said softly. "I thought we could grab a late lunch." For a moment, Alexander was speechless. The sight of her, so beautiful and full of life, filled him with a confusing mixture of love and dread. "Liv, I have meetings all afternoon," he stammered, the lie tasting bitter on his tongue. Olivia's smile faltered. "Oh, I should have called first. I just thought..." She trailed off, her hand unconsciously moving to her belly. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Alexander felt his heart racing, panic clawing at his chest. He wanted to reach out to her, to be the man she needed, but fear held him back. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't do this." Olivia's eyes widened. "Can't do what, Alex?" The dam broke. Words poured out of Alexander, a torrent of fears and insecurities he'd been holding back for months. This, he gestured wildly. Fatherhood, family, all of it. I'm not ready, Liv. I don't know if I'll ever be ready. What if I'm terrible at it? What if I can't love her the way she deserves? What if I turn into my own father? Tears welled up in Olivia's eyes. She took a step towards him, reaching out. Oh, Alex, why didn't you tell me you were feeling this way? Alexander backed away, his breath coming in short gasps. Because I'm supposed to have it all together. I'm Alexander Reeves. For God's sake. I don't fail. I don't show weakness. But this terrifies me. It's okay to be scared, Olivia said gently. I'm scared too, but we can figure this out together. But Alexander was too far gone, lost in a spiral of fear and self-doubt. No, you don't understand. I can't do this. I can't be a father. I'll ruin everything just like he did. The pain in Olivia's eyes was almost unbearable. Alex, please, talk to me. We can work through this. But Alexander had retreated behind his walls, his face a mask of cold determination. I think you should go, Olivia. I have work to do. Stunned, Olivia stood there for a moment longer, searching his face for any sign of the man she loved. Finding none, she turned and walked out, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. As the door closed behind her, Alexander slumped into his chair, his head in his hands. The weight of his fears, his inadequacies, pressed down on him like a physical force. In that moment, he made a decision that would change the course of their lives forever. Outside, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city. As darkness fell, Alexander Reeves, master of the financial world, found himself facing a crisis no amount of money or power could solve. The clock on his desk ticked relentlessly, counting down to a future he was no longer sure he could face. We need to talk, Olivia said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander loosened his tie, feeling as though it was choking him. Liv, no. She cut him off, her tone sharper than he'd ever heard it. You've done enough talking. It's my turn now. He sank into the armchair across from her, bracing himself for what was to come. Olivia took a deep breath, her hand resting protectively over her swollen belly. I've been patient, Alexander. I've given you space. I've tried to understand. But I can't keep pretending everything's okay when it's so clearly not. Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with months of unspoken tension. Do you even want this baby? She asked, her voice breaking. The question hit Alexander like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The truth was he didn't know, and that realization terrified him more than anything. Olivia's eyes filled with fresh tears. Your silence says everything, Alex. It's not that simple, he finally managed, running a hand through his hair. I'm scared, Liv. I'm not cut out for this. I'll mess it up, just like my father did. So you'd rather not try at all? Olivia's voice rose, anger mixing with her pain. You'd rather abandon your child before it's even born? The word abandon echoed in Alexander's mind, bringing back painful memories of his own childhood. I'm not abandoning anyone, he snapped, standing up abruptly. I'm being realistic. This was a mistake, Olivia. We rushed into this without thinking it through. Olivia recoiled as if she'd been slapped. A mistake? Is that what you think our baby is? That's not what I meant, Alexander backpedaled. But the damage was done. Then what did you mean? Olivia demanded, rising to her feet. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're looking for an way out. An escape from the responsibility you helped create. The accusation stung, partly because Alexander knew there was truth in it. He turned away, unable to meet her gaze. Maybe we need some time apart, to figure things out. The silence that followed was deafening. When Olivia spoke again, her voice was cold, devoid of the warmth and love that had always characterized it. If you walk out that door, Alexander, don't bother coming back. He turned to look at her, seeing the fierce determination in her eyes. This was the moment he realized, the crossroads that would define the rest of their lives. Stay and face his fears or run and lose everything. Alexander's hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob. "I'm sorry, Liv," he whispered. "I just can't do this." As the door clicked shut behind him, Olivia's anguished sob echoed through the empty penthouse. Outside, the night sky was overcast, mirroring the darkness that had descended upon their once perfect life. Alexander stood in the hallway, his heart pounding. He had made his choice, but as the finality of his decision settled over him, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, offering him an escape. As he stepped inside, Alexander Reeves, the man who had everything, realized he was about to lose it all. The doors closed, sealing his fate and leaving behind a future he was too afraid to embrace. "What have I done?" he whispered to the empty car, his voice cracking with the realization of the magnitude of his actions. With trembling hands, he reached for his briefcase on the passenger seat. Inside, he found a pen and a crisp sheet of paper bearing his company's letterhead. For a moment, he stared at the blank page, struggling to find the words that could possibly explain his actions. Finally, he began to write, "Olivia, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I know there's nothing I can say to make this right, but I hope one day you'll understand. I'm not the man you need me to be. I'm not the father our child deserves. I've arranged for a substantial sum to be transferred to your account. It's not nearly enough to make up for what I'm doing, but I hope it will provide for you and the baby. Please don't try to contact me. It's better this way. I'm sorry, Alexander." He read over the cold, impersonal words, feeling a wave of self-loathing wash over him. This was who he was, a coward hiding behind money and empty gestures. With a heavy heart, he made his way up to the penthouse. The living room was dark and silent, no sign of Olivia. He placed the envelope containing the letter and a check on the coffee table, his hand lingering for a moment as if he could take it all back. A soft sound from the bedroom made him freeze. He turned, seeing Olivia's silhouette in the doorway, one hand resting on her swollen belly. "Alex," she called out softly, her voice thick with sleep and lingering hope. For a heartbeat, Alexander considered staying. He imagined rushing to her, begging forgiveness, promising to be better. But the fear, that paralyzing, all-consuming fear, held him back. Without a word, he turned and walked out the door, the soft click of it closing behind him feeling like a death knell to their relationship. In the elevator, Alexander leaned against the wall, his legs barely supporting him. As he descended, he felt as if he was leaving a part of himself behind, the part that had dared to dream of a family, of love, of a life beyond boardrooms and balance sheets. The doors opened to the lobby, and Alexander Reeves stepped out into the early morning light. He was a man reborn, or perhaps a man destroyed. Either way, he was no longer the person who had entered that building the night before. As he climbed back into his car, he caught a glimpse of himself in the rearview mirror. The face staring back at him was that of a stranger, hollow-eyed and haunted. He started the engine, the low rumble matching the turmoil in his chest. With one last look at the penthouse windows, Alexander pulled away from the curb. He had no destination in mind, no plan beyond escape. All he knew was that he was running from responsibility, from fear, from the future he couldn't bear to face. As the city began to wake around him, Alexander Reeves disappeared into the morning traffic, leaving behind a shattered dream and a legacy of heartbreak that would echo through the years to come. "No, no, no," she whispered, her voice breaking as the weight of Alexander's words sank in. The letter fluttered to the floor, landing beside the check he'd left behind, a cold, impersonal attempt to assuage his guilt. Olivia's legs gave way, and she sank to the couch, her body racked with sobs. The pain was physical, a deep ache in her chest that threatened to consume her. "How could you do this to us?" she cried out to the empty room, her words echoing off the walls that suddenly felt too big, too empty. As the initial shock began to subside, a new emotion started to bubble up within her, anger. It coursed through her veins, giving her strength she didn't know she possessed. Olivia pushed herself to her feet, her jaw set with determination. "We don't need him," she said fiercely, her hand caressing her belly. "We'll be fine on our own." I promise you that, little one. But even as she spoke the words, doubt crept in. The reality of single motherhood loomed before her, daunting and overwhelming. Olivia's gaze fell on her phone, and with shaking hands, she dialed a familiar number. "Mom," she said when the call connected, her voice small and broken. "Can you come over? I need you." Within an hour, Olivia's mother, Eleanor, arrived, her face etched with concern. One look at her daughter's tear-stained face told her everything she needed to know. "Oh, sweetheart," Eleanor murmured, pulling Olivia into a tight embrace. "What happened?" Olivia's carefully constructed composure crumbled. "He's gone, Mom. Alexander left us." Eleanor's eyes flashed with anger, but she kept her voice soft for her daughter's sake. "Tell me everything." As Olivia recounted the events of the past day, Eleanor listened, her heart breaking for her daughter. When Olivia finished, silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. "What am I going to do?" Olivia finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor took her daughter's hands in hers, her gaze steady and reassuring. "You're going to survive this, Olivia. You're stronger than you know. And you're not alone. I'm here, your father's here, your friends are here. We'll get through this together." Olivia nodded, drawing strength from her mother's words. She placed a hand on her belly, feeling a flutter of movement within. "You're right. We have to be strong now for the baby." As the day wore on, Olivia began to formulate a plan. She wouldn't let Alexander's cowardice define her or her child's future. With her mother's help, she started making calls to her lawyer, to her doctor, to close friends who could provide support. By nightfall, exhausted but resolute, Olivia stood at the penthouse windows, gazing out at the city lights. The home that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed tainted by memories of a love that had proven false. "We're leaving this place," she said aloud, her voice steady. "We're going to start fresh, just you and me." As she turned away from the window, Olivia caught sight of her reflection. The woman staring back at her was changed. There was pain in her eyes, yes, but also a fierce determination. She was Olivia Reeves, soon to be a mother, and she would not be broken by one man's weakness. The days ahead would be challenging, filled with legal battles, public scrutiny, and the daunting task of preparing for single motherhood. But as Olivia placed a protective hand over her unborn child, she felt a surge of love and resolve. "We're going to be okay," she whispered, a promise to herself and her baby. "We're going to be more than okay." As night fell over the city, Olivia began to pack, each item she placed in her suitcase a step towards a new life, one built on her own strength and the love of those who truly cared for her. The future was uncertain, but for the first time since Alexander's departure, Olivia felt a glimmer of hope. This was not the end of her story, but the beginning of a new chapter, one she would write on her own terms. Alexander stood in his expanded corner office, gazing out at the city he'd conquered twice over. His company had grown exponentially, his personal wealth had reached staggering new heights, and his name was synonymous with business acumen and ruthless efficiency. Yet, as he stood there, he felt nothing but a gnawing emptiness. A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. "Mr. Reeves?" His new assistant called out. "The board is waiting for you in the conference room." Alexander sighed, straightening his tie. "I'll be right there," he replied, his voice devoid of the enthusiasm it once held for these meetings. As he walked down the hallway, the sound of laughter drifted from one of the offices. He paused, peering through the open door to see one of his executives showing off pictures of his newborn daughter. The pride and joy on the man's face sent a sharp pang through Alexander's chest. In the conference room, Alexander went through the motions, presenting quarterly reports and future projections with practiced ease. But his mind was elsewhere, wondering about a little girl he'd never met, a family he'd abandoned. "Excellent work as always, Alexander," one of the board members praised as the meeting concluded. "You've outdone yourself again." Alexander nodded, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thank you, gentlemen. If you'll excuse me, I have some matters to attend to." Back in his office, he slumped into his chair, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He opened his desk drawer, pulling out a small, worn photograph, a sonogram image he'd taken from the penthouse before he left. It was the only connection he had to the child he'd never known. "I wonder what you look like now," he whispered to the image, his finger tracing the outline of the tiny form. "Do you have my eyes?" Olivia's smile. The intercom buzzed, startling him from his reverie. "Mr. Reeves, your 3 o'clock is here." "Send them in," he replied, quickly tucking the sonogram back into the drawer. As he prepared to meet his next appointment, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. For all his success, all his achievements, there was a void in his life that no amount of money or power could fill. That night, as he sat alone in his luxurious penthouse, different from the one he'd shared with Olivia, but just as empty, Alexander found himself haunted by what-ifs. What if he'd stayed? What if he'd faced his fears? What kind of father would he have been? He poured himself a glass of scotch, the amber liquid glinting in the low light. As he raised it to his lips, he caught sight of his reflection in the window. The man staring back at him was successful, powerful, and utterly alone. "Happy birthday," he murmured to the phantom child he'd never known, raising his glass in a silent toast. "Wherever you are, I hope you're happy. I hope you're loved." As the city lights twinkled below, Alexander Reeves, the man who had everything, realized he had nothing that truly mattered. The empire he'd built was a hollow victory, a poor substitute for the family he'd left behind. Little did he know, fate was about to intervene, setting in motion a chain of events that would force him to confront the consequences of his choices and the possibility of redemption he never thought he'd have. "Mommy! Mommy!" a small voice called out excitedly. Olivia sat up, a warm smile spreading across her face as her 3-year-old daughter, Sophie, burst into the room, clutching a slightly crumpled piece of paper. "Good morning, my little sunshine," Olivia said, her voice still husky with sleep. "What have you got there?" Sophie clambered onto the bed, her curls bouncing with each movement. "I drawed us," she proclaimed proudly, thrusting the paper into Olivia's hands. Olivia's heart swelled as she looked at the crayon drawing. 2 stick figures, one tall, one small, stood hand in hand, surrounded by a sea of colorful scribbles. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," she said, pulling Sophie close for a hug. As she held her daughter, Olivia's eyes drifted to the empty space on the paper where a third figure might have stood. She pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the warmth of Sophie in her arms. "Mommy, can we have pancakes?" Sophie asked, her big blue eyes, so like her father's, looking up hopefully. "Of course we can," Olivia replied, tickling Sophie's sides and delighting in her giggles. "But first, we need to get you dressed. It's a big day today, remember?" Sophie's face lit up. "My first day of preschool." As they went about their morning routine, getting dressed, making pancakes, packing Sophie's little backpack, Olivia marveled at how far they'd come. The past 3 years hadn't been easy, but they'd been filled with more joy and love than she could have imagined on that terrible morning when she'd found Alexander's letter. "Are you excited about school, sweetie?" Olivia asked as she helped Sophie put on her shoes. Sophie nodded enthusiastically. "Aha, but..." She hesitated, her little brow furrowing. "What if the other kids ask about my daddy?" Olivia's heart clenched. They'd had this conversation before, but it never got easier. She knelt down, looking Sophie in the eye. "Remember what we talked about? Some families have a mommy and a daddy, some have 2 mommies or 2 daddies, and some, like us, have just a mommy. And that's okay. We have lots of love, don't we?" Sophie nodded, but her eyes still held a hint of sadness. "I wish I had a daddy too." Olivia pulled her daughter close, blinking back tears. "I know, sweetheart. I know." She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "But you know what? You have me and Grandma and Grandpa and Aunt Lisa. We all love you so much." Sophie's smile returned, bright as the sun. "I love you too, Mommy." As they left the apartment, hand in hand, Olivia felt a familiar mix of emotions, pride in the little girl she was raising, anger at the man who'd abandoned them, and a fierce determination to give Sophie the best life possible. Walking to the preschool, Olivia's mind drifted to the challenges that lay ahead. She'd recently been promoted at work, a step that would provide more financial stability but also demand more of her time. Balancing career and motherhood was a constant juggling act, but one she was determined to master. At the preschool gates, Olivia knelt down once more, straightening Sophie's little cardigan. "You're going to have a wonderful day," she said, her voice full of encouragement. "And I'll be right here to pick you up this afternoon." Sophie hugged her tightly. "Promise." "I promise," Olivia replied, her voice firm and unwavering. "I'll always be here for you, Sophie." Always. As she watched her daughter skip into the school, Olivia felt a surge of love and pride so strong it nearly overwhelmed her. They'd faced every challenge together, and they would continue to do so. Alexander's absence was a void they'd learned to fill with their own strength and the love of those around them. Wiping away a stray tear, Olivia turned to head to work, her head held high. She was Olivia Carter now, having reclaimed her maiden name, and she was ready to face whatever the day might bring. Little did she know that fate was about to throw her a curveball that would shake the foundations of the life she'd so carefully rebuilt. "Mr. Reeves," a voice called out, and he turned to see the hospital's chief of staff approaching. "We're so grateful for your company's generous donation. Would you mind saying a few words later?" Alexander nodded, forcing a smile. "Of course, Dr. Hartley. It's the least I can do." As the doctor moved away, Alexander's gaze drifted back to the crowd. Suddenly, his heart stopped. There, across the room, was a face he hadn't seen in 3 years but had never truly forgotten. Olivia. She looked different. Her hair was shorter, her posture more confident, but it was undeniably her. Alexander's grip tightened on his glass as he watched her laugh at something her companion said. Then, as if sensing his stare, Olivia turned. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and the world seemed to fall away. Alexander saw the shock register on her face, quickly followed by a complex mix of emotions he couldn't quite decipher. Anger? Pain? Regret? Without thinking, he began to move towards her, drawn by an invisible force he couldn't resist. But before he could take more than a few steps, a small figure darted out from behind Olivia, colliding with his legs. "Oops. Sorry, mister." A child's voice piped up. Alexander looked down, and his breath caught in his throat. The little girl looking up at him had his eyes, the same piercing blue that stared back at him from the mirror every morning. Her curls were Olivia's, but the shape of her face, the set of her jaw, it was like looking at a miniature version of himself. "Sophie!" Olivia's voice cut through his stunned silence. She hurried over, scooping up the child and holding her close, almost protectively. "I'm so sorry. She got away from me for a moment." Alexander stood frozen, unable to tear his gaze away from the child, his child. "Sophie," he repeated softly, the name feeling foreign yet achingly familiar on his tongue. Olivia's eyes narrowed, a flash of fierce protectiveness crossing her face. "Yes, Sophie. My daughter." The emphasis on "my" wasn't lost on Alexander. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, at a loss for words. What could he possibly say to make up for 3 years of absence? Sophie, oblivious to the tension, smiled brightly at him. "I like your tie," she said, pointing to the silk accessory at his throat. "It's sparkly." A lump formed in Alexander's throat. "Thank you," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Olivia set Sophie down, kneeling to her level. "Sweetheart, why don't you go find Aunt Lisa? I need to talk to this gentleman for a moment." As Sophie skipped away, Olivia stood, facing Alexander with a steely resolve in her eyes. "What are you doing here, Alexander?" The use of his full name, spoken with such coldness, felt like a slap. I'm a major donor to the hospital," he stammered, still reeling from the encounter. "Olivia, I had no idea you'd be here. Is she?" "Yes," Olivia cut him off, her voice low and intense. "That's your daughter. The one you walked away from before she was even born." The weight of his choices crashed down on Alexander with crushing force. He'd known intellectually that he had a child out there, but seeing her, hearing her voice, It made it all terrifyingly real. "She's beautiful," he said softly, his eyes following Sophie's path through the crowd. Olivia's expression softened for just a moment before hardening again. "She is. And she's happy, loved, and well-adjusted. We've done just fine without you, Alexander." The finality in her tone sent a chill through him. "Olivia, please, can we talk? I know I have no right to ask, but you're right," she interrupted. "You don't have any right. Not anymore." With that, she turned on her heel, moving swiftly through the crowd towards Sophie. Alexander watched her go, rooted to the spot, his mind reeling. The child he'd run from, the family he'd abandoned. They were here, flesh and blood, no longer just a distant concept. As the gala continued around him, Alexander Reeves stood alone, the weight of his past choices pressing down on him like never before. The empire he'd built, the success he'd achieved, it all felt hollow in the face of what he'd given up. And now, faced with the reality of the daughter he'd never known, he was left grappling with a burning question. Was it too late to make things right? "Mr. Reeves." A hand on his arm stopped him. It was Dr. Hartley again. "We're ready for your speech now." Alexander blinked, momentarily disoriented. I'm sorry, I can't. Not right now." He gently but firmly removed the doctor's hand and continued his pursuit, leaving a bewildered Dr. Hartley in his wake. He caught sight of them near the dessert table, Sophie's eyes wide with delight at the array of sweets. Olivia knelt beside her, whispering something in her ear that made the little girl giggle. The sound pierced Alexander's heart like an arrow. Taking a deep breath, he approached them, his legs feeling like lead with each step. "Olivia," he said softly, his voice trembling slightly. "Please, can we talk? Just for a moment." Olivia straightened up, her body tensing visibly. She turned to face him, positioning herself protectively in front of Sophie. "I thought I made myself clear, Alexander. We have nothing to discuss. I know I have no right to ask," he pleaded, his usual confident demeanor crumbling. "But please, just 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking for." Sophie peered around her mother's legs, her curiosity piqued by the stranger who seemed to know her mom. "Who's that, Mommy?" she asked innocently. Olivia's face softened as she looked down at her daughter, but her voice remained firm. "No one important, sweetheart. Why don't you go see if you can find the chocolate fountain? I'll be right there." As Sophie skipped off, Olivia turned back to Alexander, her eyes blazing with a mix of anger and pain. 5 minutes. That's all you get. And then you stay away from us. Understood. Alexander nodded, relief washing over him. "Thank you," he breathed. They moved to a quiet corner of the ballroom, the sounds of the gala fading into the background. For a moment, neither spoke, the air heavy with unspoken words and years of separation. "She's incredible," Alexander finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sophie, she's perfect." Olivia's jaw clenched. "Yes, she is. No thanks to you." The bitterness in her tone made Alexander flinch. I know I don't deserve to even be in the same room as her. But Olivia, seeing her, it's changed everything." "Changed what, exactly?" Olivia demanded, her voice low but intense. "You made your choice 3 years ago, Alexander. You walked away from us without a second thought. What could possibly have changed?" Alexander ran a hand through his hair, struggling to find the right words. "I was wrong, so terribly wrong. I've regretted it every day since, but I was too much of a coward to reach out, to try and make things right." Olivia's laugh was hollow, devoid of any humor. "Make things right? Do you have any idea what we've been through? The nights I spent crying, wondering how I was going to do this on my own? The time Sophie has asked why she doesn't have a daddy like her friends do." Each word was like a knife twisting in Alexander's gut. The pain in Olivia's eyes, the hurt he'd caused. It was almost unbearable. "I'm sorry," he said, knowing how inadequate the words were. "I know it doesn't change anything, but I am truly, deeply sorry." For a moment, Olivia's guard seemed to waver, a flicker of the connection they once shared passing between them. But just as quickly, it was gone. replaced by a steely resolve. "You're right. It doesn't change anything," she said firmly. "We've built a life without you, Alexander. A good life. Sophie is happy, loved, and surrounded by people who would never dream of abandoning her." Alexander felt the sting of her words, knowing every bit of it was deserved. "I understand," he said softly. "But please, Olivia, is there any chance at all that I could be a part of her life? Even in the smallest way?" Olivia studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. The seconds ticked by, feeling like an eternity to Alexander as he waited for her response. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady and controlled. "I need to think about this. Not for you, but for Sophie. She deserves to know where she comes from. But I won't let you hurt her the way you hurt me." A spark of hope ignited in Alexander's chest. "Thank you," he breathed. "That's more than I deserve. I promise, if you give me a chance, I'll do everything in my power to make up for lost time." Olivia held up a hand, stopping him. "Don't make promises you can't keep, Alexander. Not again." She reached into her purse, pulling out a business card. "This is my number. I'll contact you when I've made a decision. Until then, stay away from us." As she turned to leave, Alexander called out softly, "Olivia?" She paused, looking back at him. "Thank you for raising such an amazing little girl. You've done an incredible job." A flicker of emotion crossed Olivia's face, pride, sadness, a hint of the love they once shared. Without another word, she walked away, leaving Alexander alone once more. He watched as she rejoined Sophie at the chocolate fountain, the little girl's laughter floating across the room. In that moment, Alexander Reeves, the man who had everything, realized just how much he had lost, and how desperately he wanted a chance to make things right. As the gala continued around him, Alexander stood rooted to the spot, Olivia's business card clutched in his hand like a lifeline. The future, once so certain, now hung in the balance, hinging on the decision of the woman he had wronged and the forgiveness he wasn't sure he deserved. "Mr. Reeves?" A voice startled him from his reverie. It was Dr. Hartley again, looking concerned. "Are you feeling all right? You seem distracted." Alexander forced a smile, his mask of the confident CEO slipping back into place with practiced ease. "I'm fine, thank you. Just a bit overwhelmed by the generosity of everyone here tonight." As he engaged in small talk with the doctor, his attention was suddenly drawn by a commotion near the dessert table. His heart leapt into his throat as he saw Sophie, her little face scrunched up in distress, tugging at Olivia's dress. Without thinking, Alexander excused himself and moved swiftly towards them, driven by an instinct he didn't know he possessed. "Mommy, my tummy hurts," Sophie whimpered, tears welling up in her big blue eyes. Olivia knelt down, concern etched on her face. "Oh, sweetheart, did you eat too many sweets?" Sophie nodded miserably, then suddenly went pale. "I think I'm gonna be sick." Alexander reached them just as Sophie's little body heaved. Without hesitation, he grabbed a nearby ice bucket, emptying its contents onto the floor, and held it up just in time. Olivia looked up at him in surprise, their eyes meeting over Sophie's bent form. For a moment, the years melted away, and they were just two parents concerned for their child. "Thank you," Olivia murmured, her voice soft with gratitude. Alexander nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Is there anything else I can do?" Olivia hesitated, then nodded. "Could you find some water and maybe a quiet place where she can lie down?" "Of course," Alexander replied, relieved to be useful. He quickly procured a bottle of water and led them to a small antechamber off the main ballroom. As Olivia settled Sophie on a plush sofa, Alexander hovered uncertainly, torn between wanting to help and knowing he had no right to intrude. "Is she okay?" he asked softly, his voice laced with concern. Olivia nodded, brushing Sophie's curls back from her forehead. "She'll be fine. Just too much excitement and sugar, I think." Sophie looked up at Alexander, her face pale but curious. "Are you a doctor?" she asked innocently. Alexander felt his heart constrict. "No, I'm not. I'm just a friend of your mom's." Olivia's eyes flashed at this, but she said nothing, focusing instead on comforting Sophie. "You have kind eyes," Sophie mumbled sleepily, the stress of being sick having worn her out. "Like Mommy's." Alexander felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. He looked at Olivia, seeing his own emotions mirrored in her face. "I should go," he said softly, not wanting to overstep. "Will you be all right?" Olivia nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, thank you. For everything." As Alexander turned to leave, he heard Sophie's small voice again. "Mister, thank you for helping me." He looked back, his heart breaking at the sight of his daughter curled up against Olivia. "You're very welcome, Sophie," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. At the door he paused, looking back at Olivia. "If you need anything, anything at all, please don't hesitate to call. Day or night." Olivia met his gaze, her expression unreadable. After a moment, she nodded. "I'll remember that." As Alexander stepped back into the bustling gala, he felt as though he'd left a part of himself behind in that quiet room. The weight of what he'd lost, and what he desperately hoped to regain, pressed down on him like a physical force. He made his way to the bar, ordering a double scotch with shaking hands. As he raised the glass to his lips, he caught sight of his reflection in the mirrored back of the bar. The man staring back at him was changed, humbled, shaken to his core, but with a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Alexander Reeves took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. He had been given a glimpse of what could be, a chance he never thought he'd have. And he silently vowed to himself, to Olivia, and to the little girl with his eyes, that he would do whatever it took to make things right. As the gala continued around him, Alexander stood at the bar, lost in thought, the possibility of redemption tantalizingly close yet achingly far away. The night that had started as just another business obligation had become a turning point, and he knew with absolute certainty that his life would never be the same again. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out at the city lights. His eyes fell on a playground in the distance, and suddenly, unbidden, a memory surged forth. 3 years earlier, Alexander stood in the nursery of their old penthouse, surrounded by half-assembled furniture and unopened boxes. The smell of fresh paint hung in the air, mingling with the scent of new beginnings and unspoken fears. Olivia entered, her face glowing with the radiance of impending motherhood. "What do you think?" she asked, gesturing to the room. "I was thinking we could put the crib here, by the window." Alexander nodded, his throat tight. "It's nice," he managed, the word feeling inadequate. Olivia's smile faltered. "Alex, what's wrong? You've been so distant lately." He turned away, unable to meet her eyes. "It's nothing. Just work stress." "No," Olivia said firmly, moving to stand in front of him. "It's more than that. Talk to me, please." Alexander felt the walls closing in, his chest constricting with panic. "I can't do this, Liv," he blurted out. "I'm not cut out to be a father. I'll mess it up, just like my old man did." Olivia's face crumpled, a mix of hurt and confusion. "What are you saying? We've wanted this for so long." "No," Alexander snapped, harsher than he intended. "You've wanted this. I went along with it because I thought it would make you happy." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and irretrievable. Olivia stumbled back as if physically struck, her hand instinctively moving to protect her swollen belly. "You don't mean that," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Alex, please, we can work through this together." But Alexander was already retreating, both physically and emotionally. "I'm sorry, Liv. I can't." As he turned to leave, Olivia called out, her voice breaking. "If you walk out that door, Alexander, don't you dare come back." He paused at the threshold, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Part of him screamed to turn back, to face his fears, to be the man Olivia deserved. But the terror of fatherhood, of responsibility, of becoming like his own absent father, was overwhelming. Without another word, he walked out, leaving behind the life he'd built and the family he'd never know. Present day. Alexander blinked, the memory fading as quickly as it had come. He found himself on his knees, tears streaming down his face. The weight of his choices, the magnitude of what he'd thrown away, crashed over him like a tidal wave. "Oh God!" he whispered into the empty room. "What have I done?" He fumbled for his phone, pulling up the contact information Olivia had given him. His finger hovered over the call button, trembling with indecision. What right did he have to disrupt their lives again? But the image of Sophie's innocent face, of Olivia's guarded expression, burned in his mind. Before he could second-guess himself, he pressed call. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Each ring felt like an eternity. Just as he was about to give up, there was a click. "Hello!" Olivia's voice, cautious and slightly sleepy, came through the line. Alexander's breath caught in his throat. "Olivia," he managed, his voice hoarse with emotion. I'm sorry for calling so late. I needed to hear your voice." There was a long pause, and for a moment Alexander thought she might hang up. Then, softly, "Are you okay, Alexander?" The concern in her tone, however small, broke something inside him. "No," he admitted, his voice cracking. "No, I'm not okay. I haven't been okay for 3 years. Liv, I made a terrible mistake. The biggest mistake of my life. And I know I have no right to ask, but is there any chance at all that you could forgive me?" The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander held his breath, his heart pounding in his ears. When Olivia finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled, but he could hear the tremor of emotion beneath. "Forgiveness isn't something you can demand, Alexander. It's earned, and you have a lot to make up for." "I know," he said quickly. "I know, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Please, Liv. Just tell me what I need to do." Another pause, this one weighted with years of hurt and mistrust. Then, softly, "Be at the park near our old place tomorrow at 10 a.m. We'll talk then." Before Alexander could respond, the line went dead. He sat there, phone still pressed to his ear, hope and fear warring in his chest. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't even close to making things right. But it was a start. A chance he didn't deserve but desperately needed. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Alexander Reeves stood, a man transformed by regret and the possibility of redemption. Tomorrow would be the first step on a long, uncertain path. But for the first time in 3 years, he felt something akin to purpose. He had a lot to make up for, a lot to prove. But as he watched the sun rise over the city, Alexander made a silent vow. This time he wouldn't run. This time, he would face his fears and fight for the family he'd abandoned. It wouldn't be easy, and success was far from guaranteed. But he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that it was the most important fight of his life. Taking a deep breath, Alexander steeled himself and walked over. "Good morning, Olivia," he said softly, his voice laced with nervousness. Olivia looked up, her expression guarded. "Alexander," she acknowledged with a nod. "Sit down." He complied, maintaining a respectful distance between them. For a moment, neither spoke, the sound of children's laughter filling the air. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me," Alexander finally said, breaking the silence. Olivia's gaze remained fixed on Sophie. "I'm not doing this for you," she said, her voice low and controlled. "I'm doing it for her. She deserves to know where she comes from, even if that person chose to walk away." The words stung, but Alexander knew he deserved them. "I understand," he replied, "and I know I have no right to ask for anything. But I want you to know that I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to make things right." Olivia finally turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face. "And what exactly does making things right look like to you, Alexander? Because from where I'm sitting, there's no way to undo the damage you've done." Alexander swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her gaze. "I know I can't change the past," he said softly, "but I want to be here now. For Sophie. For you, if you'll let me. I want to be the father I should have been from the beginning." A flicker of emotion crossed Olivia's face. Pain, anger, and something else Alexander couldn't quite identify. "And how do I know you won't run again?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. How can I trust you with her heart when you shattered mine so easily? The rawness of her pain hit Alexander like a physical blow. He felt tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. I know I don't deserve your trust, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But I'm not the same man I was 3 years ago. Seeing Sophie, realizing what I've missed, it's changed everything. I know now that walking away was the biggest mistake of my life, and I'll spend the rest of my days trying to make up for it if that's what it takes. Olivia was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting back to Sophie. When she spoke again, her voice was soft but firm. I won't make any promises, Alexander, and I won't let you waltz back into our lives as if nothing happened. If you want to be a part of Sophie's life, you'll have to earn it. Slowly, on my terms, Alexander nodded eagerly. Of course, anything you say, I'll do whatever it takes. That means supervised visits only at first, Olivia continued. And we don't tell her you're her father. Not until I'm sure you're committed to staying. I understand, Alexander agreed. Thank you, Olivia. This is more than I deserve. Just then, Sophie's voice rang out across the playground. Mommy, look at me. She was perched at the top of the slide, waving excitedly. Olivia's face softened as she waved back. I see you, sweetheart. Be careful coming down. As Sophie slid down with a squeal of delight, Alexander felt a lump form in his throat. She's incredible, he murmured. Yes, she is, Olivia replied, a hint of pride in her voice. Then, turning back to Alexander, her expression grew serious once more. Remember, this isn't about you. It's about what's best for Sophie. If at any point I feel like your presence is hurting her, or if you show any sign of flaking out again, that's it. No more chances. Alexander nodded solemnly. I understand completely. I won't let you down. Either of you. As Sophie ran towards them, her cheeks flushed with excitement, Alexander felt a mixture of joy and trepidation. This was his chance, perhaps his only chance, to be the father he should have been all along. The road ahead would be long and difficult, fraught with the ghosts of past mistakes and the challenge of earning trust he'd thrown away. But looking at Sophie's bright smile and Olivia's cautious but open expression, he knew it was a journey he had to take. Mommy, can we get ice cream? Sophie asked, bouncing on her toes. Olivia smiled, ruffling her daughter's hair. Maybe later, sweetie. Right now, there's someone I'd like you to meet. She glanced at Alexander, giving him a small nod. Alexander's heart raced as he knelt down to Sophie's level. Hello, Sophie, he said softly, fighting to keep his voice steady. It's nice to meet you properly. I'm a friend of your mom's. Sophie regarded him curiously, her head tilted to one side. You're the man. From the party, she said. The one with the kind eyes. Alexander felt his breath catch, overwhelmed by the innocence and openness of his daughter's gaze. In that moment, he made a silent vow to himself, to Olivia, and to the little girl in front of him. He would spend every day proving himself worthy of the second chance he'd been given, no matter the cost. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its warm light over the trio in the park, Alexander Reeves felt the first stirrings of hope. The path ahead was uncertain, the wounds of the past still raw, but for the first time in years, he felt the possibility of redemption within reach. With every fiber of his being, he promised himself that this time he would not run. This time he would stay and fight for the family he'd almost lost forever. On one such evening, he sat in his leather chair, a glass of untouched scotch on the desk before him. His eyes were fixed on an old photograph, a younger version of himself with his own father, both of them wearing forced smiles at some corporate event. Why did I become you? Alexander whispered to the image, his voice thick with emotion. I swore I'd never be like this, and yet... His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Mr. Reeves, his assistant called out. You have a call on line 1. It's Ms. Carter. Alexander's heart leapt. Olivia. He quickly composed himself and picked up the phone. Olivia? Is everything all right? There was a pause on the other end. Then Olivia's voice came through, tinged with a mix of frustration and resignation. Sophie's school called. She's running a fever, and I'm stuck in a meeting I can't get out of. I hate to ask, but say no more, Alexander interrupted, already reaching for his jacket. Text me the school's address. I'll pick her up right away. As he rushed out of his office, ignoring the surprised looks from his employees, Alexander felt a surge of emotions: concern for Sophie, gratitude for Olivia's trust, and a gnawing fear of somehow messing this up. At the school, he found Sophie sitting in the nurse's office, her usually bright eyes dulled with fever. When she saw him, a flicker of confusion crossed her face. "Mr. Alexander?" she mumbled, her voice weak. "Where's Mommy?" Alexander knelt beside her, his heart aching at her vulnerability. "Your mom's stuck at work, sweetheart. She asked me to come get you. Is that okay?" Sophie nodded sleepily, and Alexander felt a lump form in his throat as he helped her into her coat. As they walked to his car, Sophie's small hand in his, he was overwhelmed by a sense of protectiveness he'd never experienced before. The drive to Olivia's apartment was quiet, Sophie dozing in the back seat. Alexander kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror, marveling at how this tiny person had completely upended his world. Once inside the apartment, Alexander felt out of his depth. He'd never cared for a sick child before. "How about we get you into bed?" he suggested gently. Sophie nodded, then looked up at him with wide eyes. "Can you read me a story? Mommy always reads to me when I'm sick." Alexander felt a pang of regret for all the bedtime stories he'd missed. "Of course," he said softly. "Let's find a good one." As he tucked Sophie into bed and began reading The Velveteen Rabbit, Alexander felt something shift inside him. The words on the page blurred as tears welled up in his eyes. "Mr. Alexander?" Sophie's small voice interrupted. "Are you sad?" He looked down at her, seeing his own blue eyes staring back at him. "No, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm happy to be here with you." Sophie smiled sleepily. "I'm happy you're here too. You tell good stories." As Sophie drifted off to sleep, Alexander remained by her bedside, overwhelmed by the love he felt for this child he barely knew. He thought of all the moments he'd missed: first words, first steps, first days of school, and felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. When Olivia arrived home, she found Alexander sitting on the couch, his head in his hands. He looked up as she entered, his eyes red-rimmed. "How is she?" Olivia asked, concern evident in her voice. "Sleeping now," Alexander replied. "The fever's gone down a bit." Olivia nodded, then studied him closely. "Are you okay?" Alexander took a deep breath, struggling to find the words. I don't know how to thank you, Olivia, for giving me this chance, for letting me be here today." Olivia's expression softened slightly. "You did well, Alexander. Thank you for being there for her." As he stood to leave, Alexander paused at the door. "Liv," he said softly, using the old nickname without thinking. "I know I have no right to ask this, but is there any chance we could talk? Really talk? About everything that happened?" Olivia was quiet for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded. "Okay," she said softly. "Not tonight, but soon. We'll talk." As Alexander left the apartment, he felt a glimmer of hope ignite in his chest. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but for the first time he felt like he might be on the right path. Walking to his car, he looked up at the night sky, the stars twinkling above the city lights. He made a silent promise to himself, to Olivia, and to Sophie. This time he would be the man they deserved. This time he would stay and fight for the family he'd almost lost forever. The journey of redemption was far from over, but as Alexander drove home that night, he felt a sense of purpose he'd never known before. The man who had once run from responsibility now found himself running towards it, arms wide open, ready to embrace whatever challenges lay ahead. One crisp Saturday morning, he stood outside Sophie's favorite ice cream parlor, his heart racing as he checked his watch for the 5th time in as many minutes. This was a risk, he knew, but one he felt compelled to take. Right on schedule, he saw them approaching, Sophie skipping along, her hand in Olivia's, chattering excitedly about the treat to come. Alexander took a deep breath, steeling himself, then stepped forward. "Olivia, Sophie," he called out, feigning surprise. "What a coincidence!" Olivia's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of suspicion crossing her face. "Alexander," she said, her tone cautious. "I didn't expect to see you here." Before he could respond, Sophie piped up, her face lighting up with recognition. "Mr. Alexander, are you getting ice cream too?" He knelt down to her level, smiling warmly. "I was thinking about it. What's your favorite flavor?" "Sophie?" "Strawberry," she exclaimed, bouncing on her toes. Alexander chuckled, then glanced up at Olivia, silently seeking permission. After a moment's hesitation, she gave a small nod. "Well then," he said, standing up, "how about I treat you both to some ice cream?" As they sat at a small table outside the parlor, Sophie happily devouring her strawberry cone, Alexander felt a mix of joy and nervousness. This was the closest he'd been to feeling like a family, and the weight of what he'd thrown away pressed heavily on his heart. "So, Sophie," he said gently, "how's school going? Are you enjoying your classes?" Sophie launched into an animated description of her art project, her eyes shining with excitement. Alexander hung on every word, marveling at her intelligence and creativity. Olivia watched the interaction closely, her expression a complex mix of emotions. When Sophie excused herself to use the restroom, she turned to Alexander, her voice low. "This wasn't a coincidence, was it?" she asked, though it wasn't really a question. Alexander met her gaze, deciding honesty was the best policy. "No," he admitted softly. "I'm sorry if I overstepped. I wanted to see her, to see both of you." Olivia was quiet for a moment, stirring her melting ice cream absently. "Alexander," she finally said, her voice tinged with a mix of frustration and something softer. "I appreciate that you're trying, but these accidental meetings, they're confusing for Sophie. And for me." Alexander felt his heart sink. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with remorse. "I didn't mean to complicate things. I just don't know how else to be a part of her life. Of your lives." Olivia's expression softened slightly. "I know," she sighed, "but we need to do this the right way. For Sophie's sake." Just then, Sophie returned, oblivious to the tension between the adults. "Can we go to the park, Mommy?" she asked, her eyes bright with hope. Olivia hesitated, glancing at Alexander. He held his breath, not daring to hope. "Actually," Olivia said slowly, "why don't we all go? If Mr. Alexander isn't too busy." "That is." Alexander felt a surge of emotion so strong it nearly overwhelmed him. "I'd love to," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. As they walked to the nearby park, Sophie between them, chattering happily, Alexander felt a sense of rightness he'd never experienced before. This, he realized, was what he'd been missing all along. At the playground, Sophie ran off to the swings, leaving Olivia and Alexander alone on a bench. For a moment, neither spoke, both watching their daughter play. "Thank you," Alexander finally said, his voice soft but fervent. For giving me a chance to be here." Olivia turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face. "I'm not doing it for you," she said, but her tone lacked the edge it once had. "I'm doing it for her. She deserves to know you, even if—" She trailed off, but Alexander understood the unspoken words. "Even if he didn't deserve to know her." "I know," he said gently, "and I promise you, Olivia, I won't waste this opportunity. I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of her, of both of you." A flicker of something, perhaps hope, perhaps just acknowledgement, passed across Olivia's face. She nodded, then turned back to watch Sophie. As the afternoon wore on, filled with laughter and small moments of connection, Alexander felt a shift in the air between them. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. A fragile bridge being built over the chasm he'd created 3 years ago. When it was time to say goodbye, Sophie surprised them both by hugging Alexander's legs. "Thank you for the ice cream and the park, Mr. Alexander," she said, her smile bright enough to light up the darkening sky. Alexander felt tears prick at his eyes as he gently patted her back. "You're very welcome, Sophie," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. As he watched them walk away, Olivia glanced back, giving him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't much, but to Alexander it felt like everything. He stood there long after they disappeared from view, his heart full of a bittersweet mix of joy and regret. The path ahead was still uncertain, fraught with the ghosts of past mistakes and the challenge of rebuilding trust. But for the first time in years, Alexander Reeves felt truly alive, truly present in his own life. As the stars began to appear in the twilight sky, he made a silent vow. He would not squander the second chance. He would become the man, the father, the partner he should have been all along. And maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to heal the wounds of the past and build the future he'd been too afraid to embrace before. With a deep breath, Alexander turned and walked towards home, his steps light with purpose and the faintest glimmer of hope for what tomorrow might bring. One crisp autumn morning, Alexander was in his office, reviewing quarterly reports, when his assistant burst in, her face pale with urgency. "Mr. Reeves, you need to see this," she said, thrusting a tablet into his hands. Alexander's blood ran cold as he read the headline splashed across the screen. Tech Tycoon's secret love child revealed. Alexander Reeves' hidden family exposed. His hands shaking, he scrolled through the article, filled with grainy photos of him, Olivia, and Sophie at the park and ice cream parlor. Anonymous sources speculated about his involvement, painting a sensationalized picture of their fragile reconciliation. "No, no, no," he muttered, his mind racing. Without a word to his assistant, he grabbed his coat and rushed out of the office, his heart pounding in his chest. As he drove to Olivia's apartment, his phone exploded with notifications. Calls from his PR team, messages from board members, all demanding explanations. But Alexander had only one thought. He had to get to Olivia and Sophie. Arriving at their building, he found a small crowd of paparazzi already gathering. He pushed through them, ignoring their shouted questions, and ran up the stairs. Olivia opened the door before he could knock, her face a mask of fury and fear. "How could you let this happen?" she hissed, pulling him inside. "Liv, I swear." "I had no idea," Alexander pleaded, his voice breaking. "I would never expose Sophie like this." Olivia paced the living room, running her hands through her hair. "Do you have any idea what this means? My phone hasn't stopped ringing. Sophie's school called. There are reporters outside." The gravity of the situation hit Alexander like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on rebuilding their relationship that he'd forgotten about the public scrutiny that came with his position. "Where's Sophie?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "In her room," Olivia replied, her anger giving way to exhaustion. "She doesn't understand what's happening. How do I explain this to her, Alexander? How do I tell her that her whole life is about to change because of who her father is?" The word father hung in the air between them, weighted with all the years of absence and recent tentative connections. Before Alexander could respond, Sophie's small voice called out from the hallway. "Mommy? Why is Mr. Alexander here? Is everything okay?" They turned to see Sophie standing there, her eyes wide with confusion and a hint of fear. Alexander felt his heart breaking at the sight of her vulnerability. Olivia took a deep breath, kneeling down to Sophie's level. "Sweetheart, there's something we need to talk about. Something important." Alexander watched, his throat tight with emotion, as Olivia gently explained the situation to Sophie. He saw the moment of realization in his daughter's eyes, the flicker of hurt and confusion that crossed her face. "So, Mr. Alexander is my daddy?" Sophie asked, her voice small and uncertain. Olivia nodded, tears in her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart. He is." Sophie turned to look at Alexander, her gaze piercing straight to his soul. "Why didn't you tell me? Why weren't you here before?" The simplicity of her questions, the raw hurt in her voice, was almost more than Alexander could bear. He knelt down beside Olivia, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I made a big mistake, Sophie," he said softly. "The biggest mistake of my life. I was scared and foolish, and I ran away. But I'm here now, and I promise you, I will do everything in my power to make it right." Sophie looked between Alexander and Olivia, her young mind struggling to process this life-altering information. "Are you going to leave again?" she asked, her lower lip trembling. Alexander felt tears spill down his cheeks as he shook his head vehemently. "No, Sophie, never again. I'm here to stay, if you and your mom will have me." He looked at Olivia, seeing the conflict in her eyes, the desire to protect Sophie warring with the recognition of Alexander's sincerity. As they sat there, a family fractured but perhaps not beyond repair, the sound of camera shutters and shouted questions filtered up from the street below. The outside world was clamoring for their story, but in that moment, nothing existed beyond the confines of that small living room. Alexander knew that the road ahead would be challenging. They would have to navigate media scrutiny, public opinion, and the complex emotions that came with rebuilding a family. But looking at Sophie and Olivia, he felt a resolve stronger than any he'd ever known. "We'll get through this," he said softly, reaching out to take Olivia's hand in one of his and Sophie's in the other. Together, Olivia hesitated for a moment, then squeezed his hand, a silent acknowledgement of the battles to come and the united front they would need to present. As the three of them huddled close, the world outside faded away. They were entering uncharted territory, a family forged in the crucible of past mistakes and public scrutiny. But for the first time, Alexander felt a glimmer of hope that they might emerge stronger on the other side. The story of the tech tycoon and his secret family was just beginning to unfold in the public eye. But the real story, the one of redemption, forgiveness, and the unbreakable bonds of family, was being written in that moment. In the quiet strength of three hearts beating as one particularly tense evening, Alexander paced the living room of Olivia's apartment, his phone buzzing incessantly with calls from his PR team. Sophie had finally fallen asleep after a day filled with tears and confusion, leaving the adults to grapple with the fallout. "We need to make a statement," Alexander said, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Get ahead of this narrative before it spirals even further out of control." Olivia, curled up on the couch, looked up at him with weary eyes. "And say what exactly? That you abandoned your pregnant girlfriend and only came back into our lives by chance? That our daughter has been living without a father for 3 years, because you were too cowardly to face your responsibilities?" Her words, sharp with pent-up anger and hurt, cut through Alexander like a knife. He stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "You're right," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't deserve any kind of public sympathy. But this isn't about me anymore. It's about protecting Sophie." Olivia's expression softened slightly at the mention of their daughter. "I know," she sighed. I don't know how to navigate this, Alexander. How do we shield her from all of this?" Alexander moved to sit beside her on the couch, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "We face it together," he said, his voice low and intense. "I know I have no right to ask this of you, Olivia, but please, let me help. Let me be the father and partner I should have been from the beginning." For a long moment, Olivia was silent, her gaze fixed on a framed photo of Sophie on the coffee table. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm scared, Alex," she admitted, using his old nickname for the first time in years. "Scared of what this means for Sophie, for our lives. Scared of letting you in again, only to have you walk away when things get tough." Alexander felt his heart breaking at the vulnerability in her voice. Slowly, cautiously, he reached out and took her hand in his. "I know I've given you every reason to doubt me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I swear to you, Olivia, on everything I hold dear, I will not run again. I will spend every day of the rest of my life proving to you and Sophie that I'm here to stay." Olivia looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of insincerity. What she saw must have reassured her because she gave a small nod. "Okay," she said softly, "we'll face this together. For Sophie." Just then, a small voice called out from the hallway. "Mommy? Daddy?" They both turned to see Sophie standing there, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly to her chest. The word, Daddy, hung in the air, new and fragile and filled with possibility. Alexander felt his breath catch in his throat. He looked at Olivia, silently asking permission. She nodded, almost imperceptibly. "Hey, sweetheart," he said gently, opening his arms. "Did you have a bad dream?" Sophie nodded, her lower lip trembling. Without hesitation, she ran to Alexander, burying her face in his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, feeling the weight of her trust and the magnitude of his responsibility. Olivia moved closer, enveloping both of them in her embrace. For a moment, they sat there in silence, a family united against the storm raging outside. "Are the bad people with cameras going to go away?" Sophie asked, her voice muffled against Alexander's shirt. Alexander and Olivia exchanged a look over Sophie's head, a silent communication passing between them. "We're going to make them go away," Olivia said firmly. "Your daddy and I are going to take care of everything." Alexander felt a surge of emotion at Olivia's words, at the implicit trust and partnership they conveyed. He tightened his hold on Sophie, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "That's right," he said, his voice steady and sure. "We're going to face this together as a family. And I promise you, Sophie, nothing will ever come between us again." As they sat there, huddled together in the soft glow of the living room lamp, Alexander felt a sense of peace wash over him. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with public scrutiny and private reckonings. But for the first time in years, he felt whole. The world outside might be clamoring for their story, but the real narrative was unfolding in the quiet moments like these. It was a story of redemption, of second chances, and of a love strong enough to overcome even the deepest wounds. As Sophie's breathing evened out, signaling her return to sleep, Alexander and Olivia's eyes met over her head. In that gaze was a promise to each other, to Sophie, and to the family they were fighting to build. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, united by a bond that no scandal or separation could break. The night deepened around them, but within the walls of that apartment, a new day was dawning, one filled with hope, forgiveness, and the unbreakable strength of a family reborn. The peaceful silence was shattered by a sharp knock at the door. Olivia's eyes flew open, instantly alert. "Who could that be?" she whispered, her voice laced with concern. Alexander gently shifted Sophie off his chest and onto the couch, then stood, squaring his shoulders. "I'll handle it," he said, his voice low and determined. As he approached the door, the knocking grew more insistent. Alexander took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever awaited on the other side. He opened the door to find a stern-faced woman in a crisp suit, flanked by two uniformed police officers. "Mr. Reeves?" the woman asked, her tone clipped and professional. "I'm Sandra Klein from Child Protective Services. We need to speak with you and Ms. Carter immediately." Alexander felt his heart drop to his stomach. He glanced back at Olivia, who had risen from the couch, her face pale with fear. Sophie stirred, rubbing her eyes sleepily. "What's this about?" Alexander asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Ms. Klein's expression remained impassive. "We've received reports of a potentially unstable home environment for the child. Given the recent media attention and the unusual circumstances of your family situation, we're required to investigate." Olivia stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly but filled with fierce protectiveness. "This is ridiculous. Sophie is perfectly safe and well cared for." "Nevertheless," Miss Klein replied, "we need to conduct an assessment. May we come in?" Alexander and Olivia exchanged a look, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Alexander nodded, stepping aside to allow the CPS worker and officers into the apartment. As Ms. Klein began asking questions and taking notes, Sophie clung to Olivia, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. Alexander knelt down beside them, placing a reassuring hand on Sophie's back. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said softly. "These people are just here to make sure you're happy and safe. We have nothing to hide." Sophie looked up at him, her lower lip trembling. "Are they going to take me away?" The question, so innocent yet so heartbreaking, hit Alexander like a physical blow. He pulled Sophie into a tight hug, fighting back tears. No, darling. Never. Your mom and I won't let that happen. As the interview progressed, Alexander and Olivia presented a united front, answering questions about their living situation, Sophie's care, and their plans for the future. Despite their outward calm, Alexander could feel the tension radiating from Olivia, could see the fear in her eyes that mirrored his own. Finally, after what felt like hours, Miss Klein closed her notebook. "Thank you for your cooperation," she said, her tone softening slightly. "We'll be in touch regarding our findings and any necessary follow-up." As the CPS worker and officers left, Alexander closed the door behind them, leaning against it with a heavy sigh. The apartment fell into a tense silence, broken only by Sophie's quiet sniffles. Olivia sank onto the couch, pulling Sophie onto her lap. "It's okay, baby," she murmured, stroking her daughter's hair. "Everything's going to be all right." Alexander moved to join them, his mind racing. This was his fault, he realized. His absence, his sudden reappearance, the media circus. It had all led to this moment. The weight of his past mistakes pressed down on him, threatening to crush him. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "This is all because of me." "If I hadn't dash," Olivia cut him off, reaching out to take his hand. "Stop," she said firmly. "What's done is done. We can't change the past, Alex. All we can do is move forward and fight for our family." Her words, her touch, sent a surge of emotion through Alexander. He squeezed her hand, nodding. "You're right," he said softly. "And I promise you both, I will do whatever it takes to keep us together." Sophie looked up at them, her eyes still damp with tears but filled with a glimmer of hope. "We're going to be okay, right?" she asked, her small voice wavering. Alexander and Olivia exchanged a look, years of hurt and mistrust melting away in the face of their shared love for their daughter. In that moment, they were no longer ex-lovers or co-parents navigating a complicated situation. They were simply a family united against the world. "Yes, sweetheart," Alexander said, his voice filled with a certainty he didn't entirely feel but desperately wanted to believe. "We're going to be more than okay. We're going to be extraordinary." As the morning light grew stronger, bathing the room in a golden glow, the three of them huddled close on the couch. The challenges ahead were daunting: legal battles, public scrutiny, the long process of rebuilding trust. But in that moment, wrapped in each other's arms, they found a strength they never knew they possessed. The world outside might be chaos, but within the walls of that small apartment, a family was forging an unbreakable bond. And as Alexander held Olivia and Sophie close, he made a silent vow to the universe. This time, he would not fail. This time, he would fight with every fiber of his being to protect the precious gift he'd almost lost forever, the love of his family. One evening, after Sophie had been tucked into bed, Alexander and Olivia sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by a sea of legal documents and newspaper clippings. The weight of their situation hung heavy in the air. "I don't know how much more of this I can take," Olivia said softly, her voice laced with exhaustion. She rubbed her temples, closing her eyes against the mounting pressure. Alexander reached across the table, gently taking her hand in his. "We'll get through this, Liv. Promise." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of vulnerability and determination. "How can you be so sure? The media won't leave us alone. CPS is breathing down our necks, and Sophie," her voice broke. "She's so confused and scared." Alexander felt his heart clench at the pain in Olivia's voice. He stood up, moving around the table to kneel beside her chair. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and intense. "I know I've given you every reason to doubt me in the past, but I swear to you, I will move heaven and earth to make this right." Olivia searched his face, looking for any sign of hesitation or insincerity. Finding none, she nodded slowly. "Okay," she whispered. "I believe you." Just then, a small voice called out from the hallway. "Mommy? Daddy?" They turned to see Sophie standing there, clutching her stuffed rabbit, her eyes wide with fear. "I had a bad dream," she whimpered. Without hesitation, Alexander scooped her up into his arms, holding her close. "It's okay, sweetheart," he murmured, stroking her hair. "We're here. You're safe." Olivia joined them, wrapping her arms around both Alexander and Sophie. For a moment, they stood there in silence, drawing strength from each other. "Why don't we all sleep in the big bed tonight?" Olivia suggested softly. "Just this once." Sophie nodded eagerly, and Alexander felt a surge of emotion at the trust and love in her eyes. As they settled into bed, Sophie nestled between them. He marveled at how quickly this had become his whole world. In the darkness of the bedroom, with Sophie's breathing evening out into sleep, Alexander turned to face Olivia. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "For giving me this chance. For letting me be a part of her life, of your life." Olivia was quiet for a long moment, and Alexander held his breath, waiting. Finally, she spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm scared, Alex. Scared of letting you in again. Scared of what might happen if I leave," he finished for her. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of their past. "Yes," she admitted, "but I'm more scared of denying Sophie the chance to know her father. Of denying myself the chance to—" She trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. Alexander reached out, gently cupping her cheek in his hand. "I'm not going anywhere, Liv. Not this time. Not ever again." In the dim light filtering through the curtains, he saw tears glistening in her eyes. Slowly, cautiously, he leaned forward, his lips meeting hers in a soft, tentative kiss. It was a kiss of redemption, of forgiveness, of new beginnings. When they pulled apart, both were breathless, overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment. "We should sleep," Olivia whispered, a hint of a smile in her voice. "Tomorrow's going to be another long day." Alexander nodded, settling back onto his pillow. But as he lay there, listening to the soft breathing of Olivia and Sophie, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. As dawn broke over the city, bathing the room in a soft, golden light, Alexander Reeves made a silent vow. He would fight with every fiber of his being to protect this precious family he'd almost lost. He would become the man, the father, the partner they deserved. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, fraught with legal battles and public scrutiny. But in that moment, with Olivia's hand intertwined with his and Sophie nestled safely between them, Alexander knew that they had already won the most important battle of all. They had found their way back to each other, forging a bond stronger than any force that might try to tear them apart. And as the new day dawned, full of challenges and possibilities, Alexander felt ready to face whatever came their way. For he was no longer just Alexander Reeves, tech tycoon and business mogul. He was a father, a partner, a protector, and he would let nothing and no one threaten the family he had fought so hard to reclaim. "Are you ready?" she asked softly, meeting his eyes in the mirror. Alexander turned to face her, taking her hands in his. "As ready as I'll ever be," he replied, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. "Where's Sophie?" "With my mother," Olivia said. "I thought it best she not be here for this." He nodded, understanding the weight of the decision they were about to face. The custody hearing would determine not just Sophie's future, but the future of their fragile family unit. As they drove to the courthouse, the city seemed unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath. Paparazzi crowded the steps, their cameras flashing like lightning in a storm. Alexander felt Olivia tense beside him as they approached. "We can do this," he murmured, squeezing her hand. Together, inside the courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation. Their lawyer, a steely-eyed woman named Janet, briefed them one last time before the judge entered. "Remember," she said in hushed tones, "stay calm, be honest, and show that you're united in your commitment to Sophie's well-being." As the proceedings began, Alexander felt as if he were watching from outside himself. He heard his own voice, steady and clear, as he recounted his past mistakes and his journey to redemption. He saw Olivia on the stand, her eyes glistening with unshed tears as she spoke of their daughter's love and need for both parents. The opposing counsel was relentless, bringing up Alexander's abandonment, the media circus, the potential instability of their situation. Each accusation felt like a physical blow, but Alexander held firm, his gaze never wavering as he answered each question. During a brief recess, he found Olivia in the hallway, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Without a word, he pulled her into his arms, feeling her clutch at his jacket. "What if we lose her?" she whispered, her voice raw with fear. Alexander pulled back slightly, cupping her face in his hands. "We won't," he said fiercely. "I won't let that happen. No matter what it takes, we're going to keep our family together." As they re-entered the courtroom for the judge's decision, Alexander felt a strange calm settle over him. Whatever happened, he knew that his love for Olivia and Sophie was unshakable. They would face this together, come what may. The judge cleared her throat, her gaze sweeping over the courtroom before settling on Alexander and Olivia. After careful consideration of all the evidence presented, she began, her voice echoing in the silent room. "It is the opinion of this court that the best interest of the child, Sophie Carter Reeves, would be served by—" Alexander held his breath, his hand finding Olivia's and gripping it tightly. The world seemed to narrow to this single moment, everything hanging on the next words to come from the judge's mouth. Granting joint custody to both parents, with the stipulation that Mr. Reeves continue to demonstrate his commitment to his daughter's well-being through regular counseling and co-parenting classes. The relief that flooded through Alexander was so intense it was almost painful. He heard Olivia's choked sob beside him, felt her arms wrap around him in a fierce embrace. Their lawyer was speaking, the judge was giving further instructions, but it all faded into background noise. They had won. They were a family, legally and irrevocably bound together. As they left the courtroom, blinking in the bright sunlight, Alexander turned to Olivia. "We did it," he said softly, still hardly daring to believe it. Olivia nodded, tears streaming down her face even as she smiled. "We did. But Alex, this is just the beginning. We have so much work to do, so much to rebuild." Alexander took her hands in his gaze intense and unwavering. "I know, and I'm ready for it. All of it. Whatever it takes, Liv. I'm in this for the long haul." She searched his face, and whatever she saw there must have reassured her, because she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's go home. Let's go to our daughter." As they drove back to Olivia's apartment, where Sophie waited with her grandmother, Alexander felt a sense of purpose unlike